Hey everybody, I hope you're doing very well. I'm back with what I hope is another fulfilled request from a viewer and friend of mine who is asking about how I dial in my amp tones on the Helix. I've decided I'm going to do a little series of videos on the ways I set up my main sounds for gigging and recording, and that way I can go into a little bit more detail on certain aspects of my preset building. I thought a good place to start would be taking a prime example of how I set my amp tones on my main go-to preset that I call All-in-One. And it's called that simply because I use it when I'm gigging or recording to cover a huge variety of musical styles, much as I try to do with my Boss Katana tones. And if you want to see how I've set those tones up, you can catch it on the link above here. But back to the Helix. Due to the floor model's amazing processing power, I quickly realised quite early on into owning this unit that there was potential to use multiple amps per preset in order to get a wide variety of tones under my feet easily. What seemed logical to me was to try and use different amps to best achieve specific tones, one for a great clean sound and one for a drive. Now, of course, there are an amazing amount of amp models to choose from, some of which will handle clean or driven tones better than others, but there are some that have a very usable range of gain on tap. These amps could be used for many different tones, simply by adjusting the drive or master level, for example. So let's look at the amp models I've chosen for the purposes of getting a clean and driven tone. Bear in mind that with all the settings I'm showing you, it will work differently for different guitars and the players using them. This is just how I've set it for my needs. So, almost by instinct, and I imagine many of you would have done the same, I went straight to the Fender type models to try and find my preferred clean sound. Now, I'm not saying that's always going to be the way to go, and there may be a video down the line that will explain why that is the case sometimes. But for what I was after, in terms of replicating many famous clean tones on equally famous records that I would often play in my cover bands, the US Deluxe Norm, which seems to be based on a Fender Deluxe Reverb, was an obvious choice. The real amp that this model is based on, as I understand it, was a staple of studios and stages everywhere from the mid-60s even to present day, being used on countless great records by the Beatles, the Eagles, Toto, Steely Dan, and many more. This amp can offer a fantastic drive sound when you push the preamp volume to break up or you whack an overdrive pedal in front of it. But what I was after was just a pure and simple, glassy but punchy clean. So let's take a look at the settings I've dialed in for that purpose.
As you can see here, there isn't anything too crazy about how I set this amp up, but something I find interesting is that the model on the Helix allows you to have a master volume for all amps, which isn't on the original Fender Deluxe. In fact, they don't even have a dial for mids or presence, which the Helix also gives to each amp model. So having these extra controls, while unrealistic, does allow me to shape the tone much easier. Personally, those two controls in particular are very crucial for altering my guitar tone, so it's great to have them available. I have the master volume at full, which seems to be the default for many of the amp models in the Helix, especially the older amp types like the Fenders and Marshalls, as they would tend to sound much better with their valve or tube circuitry really cooking at a high output level. The Helix has of course tried to emulate this, and I think it works great. If you turn the master down, you can actually hear that the amp breaks up less and is obviously quieter, true to the real thing. As for the extra in-depth controls found further down the list of amp parameters in HXEdit, I haven't touched them on this particular preset, so if you're trying to replicate these settings, just know that everything from the master down was left unaltered. To aid in giving this clean tone some extra punch, definition and volume, I have a deluxe comp compressor just in front of the amp, with fairly moderate settings. I found that the level balance between my amps before adding this in was hard to even out, given that the channel volume on my clean amp was nearly full, and still rather quiet compared to my drive amp. There are of course alternative ways to deal with this, by altering levels elsewhere in the signal chain, but this was a great sounding solution that added to my sound in more ways than just volume. The compressor is only ever on while the clean amp is active, and I'll touch on that again later. I found it was best to have the mix down at about 80% to still let some of the more natural amp response through, but mostly getting that in-your-face attack, which does help with getting your clean tone heard. With that in mind, let's take a listen to the amp, with all effects bypassed, then adding in the compressor.
Moving on to the drive tone, I'm almost ashamed to say, I went with a pretty stereotypical choice on this front. As we all know, or at least have picked up on from countless sources, Marshall amps hold a special reputation for having a powerful rock tone. AC/DC, Jimi Hendrix, Van Halen, the list of legendary users goes on and on, but that's not what actually drew me to using the Brit Plexi Bright model. This model is apparently based on the Marshall Superlead 100 amps, and if you'd like to see a video on how I've used that same model to replicate the AC/DC Back in Black era tone, then feel free to check out the link above. Anyway, what drew me to using this model was its amazing adaptability. Let me just give you one example of this from my personal experience. If I happened to be at a gig playing on the other side of the stage from my floorboard unit, and I needed to have less drive during the song, I wouldn't have to run across to the other side of the stage to do so. I could just roll down the guitar volume and have a pretty usable clean tone instantly. That in itself was quite appealing to me as a live performer, you know, not having to do a panicked run across the stage whenever I needed a clean tone. But it also goes to show that you can get such a huge gain range from one amp. It almost negates the need for a second clean amp, to be honest. Almost. Let's take a look at the amp settings to get it responding in that way that I enjoy.
So as you can see here, I did a few things differently with this amp. Let's take a look at the EQ controls first. The reason the bass is quite low at 2.2 is because, for my taste, the amp was just a little too round and bassy. My main thing as a band musician is to try and find my place in a potentially busy mix, as I've said many times, and having a load of unnecessary bass muddying that up is unhelpful. This is also why the mids, which are set to 9 by default when you load this amp up, are so high. It's those crucial mid frequencies that allow a guitar to be defined in a mix. I took the treble and presence down just a hair to ensure there wasn't too much harshness at high volumes. As far as the drive and master go, I played with this for a while. I wasn't looking for complete and utter saturation. As I pointed out before, it was more about the versatility I could get from the amp. And I felt as though the sound was a little too pushed for what I was after, while the master was on its default setting on full. So I opted to have a higher drive on 10 and bring back the master a little to around 7.1, and that felt like a good balance to me. Just like before, the extra in-depth controls, as I call them, have been left unchanged from their default settings. Now, let's hear it with no effects.
With each amp model, the Helix offers an appropriate cab to match whenever you use the amp and cab option in the effects and amp list. While this saves time, it can take up a lot of DSP and give you fewer options for adding effects later on in your preset build. In the case of my dual amp setup, this would be an issue, as I'd need a cab to go along with each amp I'm using with its own settings and still have a whole host of effects still available to me.
To avoid this DSP issue, I take the route of using each amp by itself and running both of those amps into one cab. The cab model I have chosen for this is the 4x12 Greenback 20, based on some of the Marshall 4x12 basket weave cabs you may have seen, obviously often paired with Marshall amps, which is the case for my drive amp of course, but it does work surprisingly well with the US Deluxe model, as it seems to fatten up the low end somewhat, but I take the flubbiness out by using the low cut feature, rolling up to 100Hz or thereabouts, as well as rolling off the highs above 10 kHz. Some may argue that I could go further with those cut-offs at either end, and they're probably right, but I like to keep my sound more open and allow a sound engineer to manipulate the EQ to their taste a little more. I changed the mic model to a 57 dynamic, which models a mic's response that I'm very used to working with in the real world. The default 121 ribbon mic model felt a little too woolly to me and lacked definition, which, as I highlighted earlier, is important in a band setting.
If you've copied my settings so far, and you're listening to it, and some of you are perhaps thinking, this sounds quite harsh, then try it with a band. It should work well for cutting through. I've tried not to raise too many unpleasant frequencies. It's more about raising those ones that you need to get heard. That's the key here. I would demo the sound of this cab for you, but the thing is, you've been hearing it already. So if you want to hear it again, just go back to any of the clips from before. If some of you are wondering how I go about changing between these two amps on one preset, as well as simultaneously triggering other effects like the compressor for the clean amp, then you're in luck. I'm going to take a minute to briefly explain how I map one foot switch to go between the clean and drive amp, as well as activating the clean amp's compressor, effectively becoming a channel-changing foot switch within the preset.
So as most Helix users will know, by touching but not pressing a foot switch, you can bring up a number of options for assigning an effect or amp block to that foot switch. With either of the amp blocks selected, assign the first amp to your preferred foot switch as you would do with any effect. Then, simply do the same again with the other amp block selected, and then bypass one of the now assigned amp blocks while the other remains on. This way, when you press that foot switch, it will flick between your two amps much like a channel changing switch. I repeated this process with the compressor, so that when the clean amp was on, the compressor was too. Of course, you'll need to ensure that whichever amp you prefer to trigger the foot switch light coming on is the amp selected when the light is on. You can do that by repeatedly touching the foot switch, which goes through all of the effects or amps assigned to it, and then once it's selected the appropriate amp, then you can leave it. In my case, I like to have the light on when the drive amp is active. I also like to rename the foot switch to something like clean/dirty to make its function even more obvious. Once you have it set to your preference, remember to save and name your preset.
This concludes a sort of part 1 to my mini-series on my main go-to all-in-one preset. I think what I'll be talking about next are the other tone shaping effects that I run with these amps in order to further enhance their sonic capabilities. Or in English, I'll be talking about overdrives and solo boosts. On the other hand, if there are other aspects of the preset that caught your eye from looking at the various screenshots throughout the video, let me know down in the comments what you'd like to see me cover first, and I'll see if I can get to that sooner rather than later. And here we are at housekeeping again. Here we go. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel so you can catch any content like this, plus anything else that you'll no doubt enjoy. If you fancy a bit of online guitar tuition with me, then you can get in touch on my socials, which, as ever, are linked below. But until the next one, people, stay safe out there, stay positive, and stay musical.